And hello, friends, and Happy New Year from all of us at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. We hope that you had a good break and come into the year refreshed and ready for action. Washington, D.C., where I'm sitting today, is abuzz right now, as you might expect. We had more than 6 inches of snow, which is a big deal for Washington, D.C., and now freezing cold weather. We had a new Congress launched, presidential election certified, a new administration, new Congress getting ready to start to take action. I should also note, I think, that this week we're celebrating the life of Jimmy Carter. On Thursday is his funeral at the National Cathedral. And for all of us, it's worth remembering that Jimmy Carter was president when the Department of Education came into being. Here is a little semi-famous poster that was created to celebrate that occasion back in 1980. And I have to say, at the risk of seriously dating myself, I should note that I actually worked a summer job in the general counsel's office of that brand new agency starting just 1 month after the department was opened, summer of 1980. Appropriate assignments for a first-year law student. I worked on regulations related to abating or containing asbestos in schools. So all these Washington notes are perhaps especially appropriate today as we delve into our inaugural webinar of the year, Beyond the Ballot, Sustaining Progress in Academic Recovery and Early School Success. Specifically, today, we want to get an early read of the new opportunities and the new hurdles that the election may have created. When I say the election, I might say the elections, since there were many at all kinds of different levels. It's an old saw to say that elections have consequences. And it's true, of course, but it's often not so easy to say what those consequences will actually be. There was some talk, I would say even some hot talk, about education in the recently completed campaigns. But beyond the hot talk and mixed with some comfortable platitudes, there was actually very little substantive talk about kids and education. And that's why it's really not quite clear what the consequences for education policy and practice are going to be. But now that the election is well past, the new administration, new Congress are starting to take shape, we're here today to start to sort out what we might expect and what we all might do in the coming months. We have potentially the world's greatest group of guests to discuss this subject, a group of people who are our close friends, our key partners, they're deeply connected and they're keen observers, and who are also all personally delightful. So I'm thrilled and excited they're all here today, and I get to talk to them and hear their insights and their guidance about how we think about what's about to happen. Before we go any further in talking about the consequences of this election, I just want to issue a little reminder about the campaign's positioning. We are nonpartisan. We've been successful at working with leaders from all parties and all viewpoints at the federal, state, and local level. And we've consistently found that early literacy and early school success are areas where there's actually broad bipartisan and trans-ideological commitment. We've seen strong leadership, investment, innovation, and real progress from folks on the left, on the right, and in the middle. And we expect that to continue. That said, we are unwavering in our commitment to literacy and early school success and to creating the conditions for learning, favorable conditions for learning and growth for all young people, paying special attention to those who are part of economically fragile families and those who hail from historically marginalized groups and communities. We have focused and will continue to focus on the persistent gaps in learning and school success that many of those young people have experienced. We are confident, though I would say, that this focus and these values are shared by folks across a wide range of the political spectrum. And the other reminder I want to say about the campaign is that we at the campaign always choose optimism. We believe that there are always opportunities for progress, and we will seek them out and pursue them. So with that backdrop, let me introduce, and actually in every instance of this webinar, reintroduce our guest for today's conversation. Jean-Claude Prizard is the president and CEO of Digital Promise, a global nonpartisan nonprofit organization focused on accelerating innovation in education. Denise Fort is the president and CEO of Education Trust and is one of the country's leading voices on educational equity. Kevin Huffman is the founding CEO of Accelerate, a national initiative that seeks to embed high-impact tutoring and personalized learning in public schools. And Kevin is also the former Tennessee Commissioner of Education. Mike Petrelli is the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and a well-published expert on charter schools, school accountability, evidence-based practices, trends in test score. Mike's an expert in a whole bunch of stuff, and fantastic. So I should also note that we were expecting Yvette Fuentes from Start Early to join us today, but she had a family emergency. We send our best to her and look forward to having Yvette join us for future webinars. So with that backdrop, let's start with the big picture, if we might. There was a fair amount of heat around the future of the Department of Education in the campaign. It's a pretty easy issue for political folks to talk about, not super complicated, and a pretty easy question for the media to cover. Again, not super complicated. Seems to me that other policy choices, less political probably, and less easy for journalists to cover, are likely to have a bigger impact at the ground level than this debate about the Department of Education. But to get a sort of the big picture, I'd like to start by trying to separate some of the signal and the noise here. Specifically, I'd like to hear from each of our guests today what you expect are the top one or two major changes you expect to see because of the results of the election. Mike, how about I ask you to kick us off?
I'd be happy to, John. And hello, everybody. I really appreciate the invitation to speak today, and it's great to see all the names popping up in the chat. Lots of friends. Hello, hello. Yeah, so John, first, let me just say what I don't think is going to happen. Okay, I don't think the Department of Education is going to be eliminated, and I don't think that we're going to see huge cuts to the major education programs. And in both cases, that's just because those actions would require 60 votes in the Senate, votes that Republicans do not have. And so you can thank the founders on this one in designing our constitutional arrangements to try to make it harder for the president to take unilateral action. So for better, for worse. I think the concerns, I understand the concerns about some of those kinds of changes that people are hearing about, but is very unlikely. And the big structural changes, they are things that would take Congress to do. That said, there are some things that a new Trump administration can do unilaterally, mostly through regulation. I think that the big place where we're going to see a lot of action is around the Office for Civil Rights. And I think we can get into this in more detail as we go through. But, this is the place where a lot of the culture wars have been fought, where on really both sides, you see the administration's trying to push their vision on some issues like the transgender rights issue, how to interpret Title IX writ large, the concern that you hear from the right about indoctrination or the social justice stuff in the schools. And there was some of that coming from the left in the current administration. So I think the Office for Civil Rights, you'll see some action. There'll be small changes to some of the programs. So, for example, a lot of those of us that support charter schools did not love the Biden administration's regulations that were put out on the federal charter school program. I think you'll see those rolled back. But that's pretty small ball, And so when it comes to what is at least within the contours of the federal U.S. Department of Education, I think you're going to see fairly limited action. Part of that is because the federal role, as we know, is just much more limited than it was, even a decade ago. That when No Child Left Behind was replaced with the Every Student Succeeds Act, a lot of authority went back to the states, and there's not a lot there in Washington, to change to begin with. So leave it at that for now. I'm sure we can
Great,
dig into more detail as we go.
great. Denise, join us. Nice to see you, Denise. Thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. You know that I love hanging out with the campaign.
We love hanging out with you.
Also, Mike
Tell
and I
me,
are always on a journey together. So we do a lot of things together. So I'm happy to be with him too.
good, good. Tell me what you think about what are the big changes you expect to see because of the results of the elections?
Yeah, I would agree with Mike that they're not going to be able to wholesale get rid of the Department of Education. I do think, though, we need to watch out for some of the personnel changes, programmatic changes that can occur just because the department decides not to do something. A lot of the action from Trump 1 came from the top floor, came from the secretary's office. Many other offices that had been around to provide guidance to states, supports to states, were pretty much made ineffective. And I think that's troubling and something we need to keep our eye on. I think the other place that I have much deeper concerns is a process called reconciliation. It's very technical, but it does allow the Senate to make changes with only 50 votes.
Right.
And this process, it's a budgetary process, but it could be used to really harm some fundamental programs that may not be run by the Department of Education, but are run by other agencies and still touch our students. This could include Medicaid. This could include child nutrition programs. So I think we need to keep an eye out on some of the intersectional programs that support our young people in school. And I know that's what we're going to be doing at EdTrust. And I think the other thing that we have concerns about, and again, this happens with reconciliation, is what public dollars they'll be using to support education savings accounts or other tax credit schemes that are ultimately voucher programs. And, this idea that we would use public funds to support those efforts is devastating, especially when we know that 90% of young kids are in public schools. So we need to keep our eye on that. We need to remind the senators what will occur in states with public funds if that's to happen.
Got you. Thank you. Very helpful and really appreciate your broadening the aperture there and thinking about other things that affect children and their families that will have a ripple effect on educational opportunities and conditions for learning. Kevin, join us, please.
Hey,
Nice to
thanks,
see you.
John.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. What's your take? What do you expect to see sort of at the highest level?
Yeah. So, as I was jotting down notes this morning, I got an email from Tim Daly, who writes and thinks on education. And the title of the email was, "Nobody knows what's going to happen in education this year." So maybe that's just an important consumer warning for the audience right now as we speak.
Excellent. I love that.
I was really disappointed in the election and in the way the election discussed education and didn't discuss education. We're in the middle of an outcomes crisis right now in the country, and we have major problems that will ripple through the economy of this country over the next 2 decades if we don't take them on. And in particular, beyond the fact that kids are now scoring lower than they did a decade ago, the gap between the top quartile kids and what's happened to them and the bottom quartile kids and what's happened to them over the last 5 years is really, really profound. I think one outcome of this election is there's no big national vision that's coming from DC. There's no race to the top. There's no child left behind. There's not going to be some clear articulation of a vision to improve student outcomes that is going to come from DC. And to the extent that people have been waiting on marching orders, waiting for the cavalry to come and tell people how we're going to fix this fundamental problem in student outcomes, that is not going to happen from Washington, DC, which I think creates a world where everyone can sort of, just go about business as usual, or where a coalition of philanthropy and nonprofits working with districts and states could actually start to actively try to work on a plan to take on student outcomes. And so the biggest thing that I have my eye on is knowing that DC is not going to create this sort of compelling central vision for how we are going to take on the problem that kids know less than they did a decade ago. Are we going to be able at local levels, at state levels, in coalitions, keep our eye on outcomes and not be distracted by the endless posturing and culture wars that I think have driven a lot of the discussion in education?
Very helpful, Kevin. Thank you. Jean-Claude, you get the first last word, but you won't get the last word. I feel confident. So nice to see you, Jean-Claude. Really appreciate you joining this conversation, and curious what you've got your eye on right now.
John, thank you. And like everyone else, I'm really happy to be here among such esteemed company. Let me try to be additive and not repeat what's been said. I completely agree with Mike, Kevin, and Denise on everything, frankly, they've outlined. I worry about a couple of things. One is that because of speculations, folks will make decisions without regulation. So let's make sure that we're not making decisions based on assumptions of what may or may not happen. I agree that the Department of Ed is not going anywhere. And I worry about the capacity of the DOE, the civil servants who may or may not leave, in making sure that we have leadership at the highest levels in education. We do a lot of work here across the country. We do a lot of work internationally. And I can tell you the rest of the world is watching and trying to find ways to leapfrog us in the US. We need leadership around research. There's a coalition of us who've been working on pushing for the kind of rapid cycle research to really move the education agenda forward. You go back to the science of reading with IES, the question, IES's funding is not increased in a very long time. How do we make that a leader in terms of really pushing for the kinds of support that LEAs and schools need to really do the work that needs to be done to close gaps and accelerate our learning? When you see the proliferation of artificial intelligence, this current administration has done a lot in moving this ball forward. We need the ball to keep moving to make sure that we remain a leader in STEM, we remain a leader, frankly, in emerging technologies. If we don't have leadership at the highest levels in supporting the work of school districts, CMOs, and schools and classrooms, then we're in deep trouble. So that for me is the biggest worry, that if we see the Department of Ed flatline, we're not going to be the leader in the world that we need to remain and to be.
Thank you. Really helpful. So, Mike, you said that a lot of stuff moved to the States some time ago. It's pretty easy to imagine that more things will move to the States. And all of you really emphasize this worry about something of a vacuum of leadership and thinking, creativity, and innovation at the federal level. What do you see at the state level? If that becomes more of the locus of action, what do you see? What gives you hope from states, and what gives you concern at the state level?
Yeah. So let me first express what I think the conventional wisdom is, which is that both parties have been running away from education reform. And for Democrats, it's moving further to the left on a lot of issues. And in some cases, that means getting closer again to the teachers' unions. And for Republicans, it's running to the right and focusing just on private school choice, education savings accounts. Now, my own view is that that conventional wisdom has some truth to it, unfortunately, especially when it comes to the Democrats. And this doesn't make me happy, but it is hard to look at blue states, especially the deep blue states, and in my opinion, find a whole lot to be optimistic about. So for example, the Every Student Succeeds Act said to the states, okay, we're going to hand a lot of this back to you, and you get to decide how to handle a lot of the accountability pieces. And the blue states, all of them except for Rhode Island and Maryland, decided we are not going to rate schools any longer. They didn't, not just the A to F or 1 to 5 stars like you see in a lot of the red states, but no ratings at all. We're just gonna we'll collect. They are mandated to put the data out there, to put it up on a website, but we're not going to issue any judgments. Other than the bare minimum of what's required on the federal level. I think that's interesting and telling. I think you see similar backing away on charter schools, similar backing away. Even on the science of reading, where there's a lot of bipartisan support, you still haven't seen as much action in states like New York and California, Illinois, as you have in other places. So I think, unfortunately, it's really tough right now in the blue states where there doesn't seem to be a lot of action. Now, in the red states, I would say that, yes, there's been all this enthusiasm around private school choice that's gotten a lot of attention from the media. But there is still the other stuff still happening, that you've got a lot of pretty mainstream Republicans, not super Trumpy, in big important states like Ohio and like Georgia. And in those places, you continue to see a focus on accountability, on charter schools, on what you might say were the meat and potatoes of the education reform movement, back in the day. So I think what we're seeing is just, the red states versus blue states going in very different directions. Frankly, I have more optimism about some of those red states because they haven't backed away from accountability and high quality public school choice as much. Of course, in most of those red states, the schools also weren't closed as long during the pandemic. And so, a couple of weeks, we're going to see new NAEP scores come out. I don't think we're going to see great news anywhere, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see at least more of a bounce back in those places that have continued with some of the key ed reform policies.
Well, thank you, Mike. We're lucky, Kevin. You were the top education official in a red state. What do you think about what is happening and what might happen at the state level, particularly if states have more control even than they have today over certain kinds of resources?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Mike said is true. 2015, ESSA put a lot of responsibility and authority back to the states. And so in many ways, it's not a significant change. I don't think states have to reconfigure themselves to take on new authority. What I've seen in states, and immediately after ESSA, I did a bunch of consulting in different states. And it was interesting as I went around and looked at states' ESSA plans and tried to counsel people. The biggest challenge that I saw was just a lack of focus. It wasn't, oh, people are being political or they're being scared or they're not willing to do hard things. It was left to their own strategic devices. People would create 18 priorities instead of 4, and everything would get sort of pretty diffuse. And even before the pandemic, you were seeing less and less academic progress. And I don't think that's accidental. So that's just like one important backdrop. What I do think is, because states have been doing this for a while, I do think that they have the capacity to make and lead meaningful change. And we have seen a number of states in my space where we're working with states on high dosage tutoring. We've seen a number of states that are continuing to ask the question, what can we do to take on the fact that kids have fallen farther behind? How can we operate in a way that is evidence-based? How can we carve out time and lead change that will lead to better student outcomes. So I don't think there's any sort of uniform answer to, where states are. What I do think is we have to, across the country, figure out how to bring pressure to bear to ensure that we're focused on student outcomes, particularly for the highest need kids in this country. And if there is not going to be federal accountability around student outcomes, people are not willingly going to raise their hand and say, please hold me accountable. We have to figure out how to, in coalitions, bring pressure to bear to drive student outcomes. And that becomes the basis for everything. Do you want people to do evidence-based strategies? Well, if they're accountable for outcomes, they are more likely to do evidence-based strategies. If they are not accountable for outcomes, if nobody is talking about it, then they're more likely to do things based on the way things have always been done, et cetera.
I want to come back to that thought, but since so much of the heart of the campaign is this notion of informed demand for focus, for action, for high quality implementation, I want to come back later to what you were just saying, Kevin, about accountability and who can do what and what can folks in the grade level network do. And I think you began to answer that. Denise, I know you have some questions about capacity at the states, and that gives you some concerns. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, we are engaged in 8 states right now. And so we do see a spectrum of success in some areas and then a lack of movement in other states. Capacity really does, however, boil down to leadership. Those decisions that are made at the top and then hopefully implemented well really matters. And I'm sad to say that I don't think we're seeing that much leadership in many of these states. Now, I will also say that there is states have tended to be laboratories of opportunity. And I think through ESSA, there was hope that more states would take that opportunity. We didn't see that. And of course, the pandemic did not help that at all. But certainly there is lack of capacity in state education agencies. Their numbers have gone down in terms of where they're going to place their focus. There are a ton of states that do now have someone specifically tagged to do something around reading instruction and high quality curriculum, but you don't see the same emphasis in math. And I do think in many instances, as Kevin pointed out, folks took on a whole bunch of different challenges that weren't very coherent. And as a result, they were all over the map. You could see that in ESSA plans, but you certainly see that now around student performance.
Jean-Claude, I'm curious about your thought, and then I want you to hinge us into if states have a leading role, probably even more. What are your concerns? And then what do you see as the federal role, the appropriate federal role, if states are really in the lead that provides the right kind of support and accountability?
John, let me start first of all by responding perhaps to Kevin and Denise. Most people here know I'm twice former school superintendent, so I that's my view of the state and the federal agencies and the support I needed to do the work I wanted to get done. I find most states to be compliance machines, not innovation machines. And there are exceptions. So like I have good friends, my good friend Angelica in Rhode Island, Sidney Dixon in Utah, who are doing amazing work, frankly, in pushing us state toward the kind of innovation. Those are, again, there are a few more, but really amazing exceptions. But for the most part, they're compliance machines. They can tell me how to cross the T and dot the I really well. That doesn't mean I'm not going to have 20% special ed referrals in my district. So those things are frankly a challenge. You know, one thing we did with I know that there was a post earlier from Hillary on the education, the Futures Council paper we wrote with the Hoover Institution at Stanford. We actually outlined what we think the role should be for feds and for the state education agencies. Yes, accountability is important. We have to double down on student outcome as long as we really redefine what that is. I want to push that really hard. That math and literacy proficiency are important. They're critical. They're not the final end means. We tend to, especially in poor schools, hold up math and reading proficiency as the North Star. It is a means to an end. And I have children. I have 3 kids in school, in grade school. That for me, I expect them to know how to read and write and add. I know it's a challenge for us in many parts of our country, but my goal for them is so much more broader around, you know, economic mobility, happiness in the future, etc. We have to broaden the definition of success here, and that's something we need to double down on. When you think about the federal role, I go back to IES, I go back to National Science Foundation, and their role in effectively providing amazing kinds of knowledge to the LEAs and the SEAs, and the SEAs in turn supporting the schools on how to really push what we know on evidence-based practices. Like science and reading, we've known about this for 20 plus years, and now it's the talk of the town, for Christ's sake. It took us that long to understand that reading is rocket science. We have to focus on what works and what doesn't work. We've lied to teachers for a long time about how to teach reading. Let's admit that. And say, where is the role, frankly, of a state education agency or federal education agency pushing that kind of research-based practice into schools? That has been missing. When you think about the economies of scales work, when you think about making sure resources are allocated equally or equitably, right? Those things belong to the SEA and the feds, ultimately to the school districts as well too. But it's so much more around guidance, around support that needs to be there in conjunction with accountability. If we push one piece only on accountability, we're not going to be successful. We've been doing this for decades. It's got to be both and state and federal agencies can support that kind of accountability and support around what we know actually works. Right now, these agencies are not doing that really well. And you have teachers and principals and districts on their own trying to figure out what is evidence-based, what is not. I would love to see What Works Clearinghouse actually do what it was designed to do in supporting what is happening in our classrooms and in our schools. That the feds can actually help us do that.
Mike, you're well known for thinking a lot about accountability, and I wonder how you think about accountability in a setting that is more state-driven, resources more controlled at states and at local levels, and an accountability that speaks to some of what Jean-Claude just referenced, which is an accountability that goes beyond sort of the things that are most easy to test and to count. Talk a little about accountability, because again, I want to think about what is it that people in our network should be thinking about, and where are there opportunities for them to plug in and create pressure or support. We always think about pressure, but there are also a lot of people who are trying to do good things in tough environments, and what they really need is some support. So talk a little about the accountability question.
Yeah, and look, I know accountability. We all like accountability in theory, and then when we start getting real about what it means, nobody really likes it, because it's about tough love. It's about doing things that are unpleasant. Look, I think everywhere in the country right now, like Kevin said, we have a crisis that did not get any attention in this presidential campaign. That we don't hear, most governors talking about either. That kids are still at least a grade level behind, especially in math, the lowest achieving kids even further. This is going to have real world consequences on them. They're going to earn less as adults their entire life because we have not helped them catch up. Okay, that is serious consequences here. And the question is, why is our education system not willing to do more to prioritize the needs of kids? And look, I think what we've known for decades is that there's tons of great people inside our system, but this 150-year-old system we've got is broken and dysfunctional in lots of places. It's really hard for good people to do good work. And external pressure is needed, especially on the political actors, on the school boards and at the top. So, what can we do? Well, look, I mean, some of this we know from at the state level. It means starting with being honest about which schools are successful and which are not. I've been sharing in the chat this map showing again. Are you willing to say that some schools are A schools and some schools are F schools? I mean, that's the beginning. If you don't like that terminology, use 1 to 5 stars. You got to do it right. You got to make sure you're looking at student level growth. How much progress are kids making from one year to the next? And yes, we shouldn't just look at test scores. Now, chronic absenteeism is in almost every state plan, as well it should be. That's another one. I mean, we still have this huge chronic absenteeism crisis, and that's another place for us to push. And then it comes down to what are we actually doing about schools that are chronically low performing? Denise and Ed Trust have put out tons of great stuff over the years, including recently on the right way to think about support and interventions. I would just say, the other big thing that's happening out there in the real world is that we have an enrollment crisis. Because of the baby bust, there's not as many kids as there used to be. The cohort with the most kids, they are right now juniors and seniors in high school. Every year behind them gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So we're going to have to close a bunch of schools. Again, that's not pleasant, but you can intersect that with the accountability push and say, hey, when making these decisions, let's close the schools that are not getting the job done for kids, the schools that are not making progress year over year, where the value added, the student level growth is very low. Those, if the states are doing their job, those should be the schools that are getting the 1 stars and the F ratings. And so, as unpleasant as that is, it means kids will be moving from the worst schools into somewhat better schools. And after the transition, that is better for those kids. So again, none of this, I'm not seeing a lot of hearts flying out there on the screen right now with my comments. I get that. Okay, but this is the kind of tough love stuff we've got to do.
There you go. There you go. There you go.
Thank you. I got a few.
That's very helpful. Let's shift a little to talking about funding for a second. You mentioned it at the top of the show, Mike. People are now really starting to experience the funding cliff. We hear it from schools, we hear it from programs around schools all the time. I think people, because of various things that have happened, people have gotten used to a greater flow of federal dollars than have historically been the case. And that seems to be slowing, maybe stopping or changing. Kevin, how do you think about the funding environment going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, and it ties together with the questions around accountability and support and guidance and focus for states as well. High dosage tutoring, where I spend my days, is actually an interesting laboratory for all of this, because ESSER funding and the crisis of the pandemic really put a lot of wind in the sails of high dosage tutoring. Now you've got this thing a few years later it polls better than any other education intervention with the public. So parents like it and want it. Its research base is stronger than any academic intervention, and so it works. Districts want it. More districts have used it each of the last 3 years. But it was paid for largely with ESSER funding, its growth was. And it's a real moment where the question is getting called by states. And I think in some places, states and districts where they've been very serious about academic interventions, about outcomes, about doing things that work, are going to continue to figure out how to direct resources that way. There are a lot of places that won't. There are a lot of places that will say, you know, when I look at the things that we need to cut as funding goes down, it's going to be a sort of last in, first out rather than a let's look at what works and fund the things that work and stop funding the things that don't. And that ties together then with the question of, do people feel like they're responsible for outcomes? Are their feet really being held to the fire to deliver outcomes for kids? Because if they are, then they're more likely to make hard decisions with funding that is rooted in the question of what works and what doesn't. And so while I agree with Jean-Claude that accountability alone doesn't get the job done, you need guidance, you need support as well. Otherwise, just telling people, you know, you're doing a bad job is insufficient to the task. I also think that in the absence of accountability, it's just too easy for people to spend money on the things that are the easiest to keep doing and would be the hardest and most painful to stop doing. And so it's a moment in time where we really need to reroute everybody in what we're trying to do in schools, which is ensure that kids actually have a real chance in life at success. And then we need to drive the resources in a direction that gets that done. And one last thing on the money, one dirty little secret that for all the sort of states' rights people in, you know, like 10th Amendment, we need to, you know, let the states have all the power. And most of these SEAs are like propped up on federal money. Most of these SEAs, like 50% of their staff is paid for with federal money. And so I hope federal money doesn't go away. But what cannot happen is you can't both take federal money away and say, now go get it, states, because the states are not appropriating money for their SEAs. They're riding on the backs of the feds for this.
Wow,
So
interesting.
can I quickly add something to
Please,
Kevin,
please.
which I completely agree with everything you just said. And I had a discussion with a former chief in North Carolina, which I believe did not win re-election, unfortunately. You know, one thing I loved about what they were trying to do was to teach districts how to know something works and doesn't work. One of the challenges we have, large school districts in the country, when you're spending money on these programs, etc., including ed tech products, they don't really know what's working and what's not working. So when you think about the funding situation and making sure you keep funding what works and defund what doesn't work, I only wish they really knew what is working, what is not working. That's a challenge for them.
You know, Jean-Claude, it's super interesting. We've had this conversation before. It's very seductive to invest in ed tech, which seems more leveraged and cheaper over time, fewer people involved, et cetera, et cetera. Yet, as you've pointed out time and again, people do not have a very clear idea of what's effective. So they buy what the best salesperson tells them to buy, and then they've got a big commitment to it, and you're going fast down the wrong street. So yeah. Denise, how do you think about the funding environment right now, and what are you keeping your eyes on? What should we keep our eyes on?
Yeah, you know, after all of that, with the ESSER dollars, as that was released by the federal government, one thing that we saw early on is there was really no requirement that they spend dollars on things that we know that work. We were finally able, I think, in maybe the third tranche, to make sure there was a focus on summer learning and high dosage tutoring. But then we didn't have any requirements put on states or districts to look at the efficacy of what is going on. And I think, you know, what happens with policymakers is their first inclination says, we're spending all this money and we're not getting anything for it. And
Yep.
why are we spending all this money? So I'm not positive at all that we'll see any increase in funding. It'll probably be flatline for the next 4 years. But again, I do think we need to take a close look at what that means for state budgets, because states aren't going to be making up the difference.
Yeah.
And what we are really hoping this might bring about is a deeper conversation about how state formula funding should be implemented, and whether that can be done that looks at resource equity, because many of these state-based formula funds are already so inequitable. Um, there's a real opportunity to have a conversation around that.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful, Denise. Let me stick with you for a second and shift to this question of how do we do to keep the focus on those young people who need the greatest support. You know, one of the central tenets of the campaign is to keep our attention on the gaps, what Kevin was talking about, and to focus on young people who are growing up in these economically fragile families and historically marginalized community. And it feels like in the environment that you all are discussing, one of the potential challenges is how to keep appropriate focus there.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I would say to you all that 3 things are really important here. Please keep calling out for data from your school districts, from states, even from other partners on the ground, local universities. We need to have data from communities so like we can really understand what's going on in terms of academic performance. So, and this is something that you as community members can do to put pressure on school districts, put pressure on states, put pressure on universities to be partners to help drive some of the data reporting, because that's so very important. And it's not just about demographics. We want to know what types of programs they're using in schools, what their efficacy looks like, how they're being evaluated. Do they have diverse teachers in the classroom? Do they have access to advanced coursework? This is something that Mike and I have been talking about for a while, because there's a lot of evidence to show that access to advanced coursework absolutely helps students across the board.
Yeah.
So our school districts really looking at that type of data. I think the other thing that's really important is storytelling, and goodness knows this is where the campaign and all of your partners really come to play. You are providing direct services, you know the impact of your programs, and again, that's all based on data, but you need to be able to tell the story, because that will influence policymakers. So we are big on crafting a narrative that really talks about how students, school districts are doing in school right now, and also to look at the trend lines, how they were doing before this policy was implemented, how they're doing now. That is a really important part of the storytelling. And then the last thing, and I think many of you are doing this already, is doing this work through coalitions. Kevin mentioned this earlier, but the more voices that we have from the community, calling for data, doing the storytelling, and using that information to really have policymakers understand what is at stake here, that we can't leave any more talent behind. That's our goal. So data, storytelling, coalitions.
Yeah, and
That's good.
if I can jump in here, I
Please.
know on the chat and in the questions, a lot of people understandably worried about some of the federal programs that they have direct impact on. Look, we should fully expect that the Trump administration, in their annual budget requests, they will put forward a very draconian education budget, right? They're going to propose slashing spending dramatically. But if we remember our civics 101, the president proposes, the Congress disposes, right? It's Congress that decides how the spending works. And in a closely divided Congress, with the House having just a tiny, couple of Republicans in the majority, and then even the Senate with just 3 Republicans. There's going to be a lot of pressure on the more moderate Republicans, folks from swing districts, swing states, not to make those cuts, because cutting education spending is very unpopular, right? So I do think, there's going to be a lot of work to communicate, like Denise said, those stories to people in Congress. That's where the action is. So don't freak out when you see the president's budget request, is one thing I'd say. On the flip side, on the possible good news, one thing we haven't mentioned is when that reconciliation bill happens, if it happens. One big debate on the Republican side is whether there's going to be room for a big child tax credit, like we had during the pandemic, and like J.D. Vance, future vice president, has said he supports. This is, what the Republicans who are saying they want to be the party of the multiracial working class, if they want to make good on that, this sort of proposal of trying to get money in the pockets of parents, especially low-income, working class, middle-class parents, that's how they might do it. But there's going to be a big pressure to spend that money on tax cuts for the rich instead. So that's going to be another debate where I think this community could weigh in. And I don't know. I don't know what to expect. I think this one's going to be very interesting to watch, and I think some pressure can make a difference.
Hey, John, if I can add, one thing that we've seen in past efforts is that some of these federal funding, to Mike's point, benefit poor white urban or poor white rural communities, as well as poor urban Black, brown communities. The same benefits that goes to rural Alabama supports Southside Chicago. So you're going to see this kind of bipartisan push or disposition of the kinds of effort you may see from a draconian budget process. The fact is that both sides of the aisle and their communities benefit from some of this education funding. You're going to see a battle, frankly. And from what I've heard is that the president has been told, do you really want to have a budget battle in your first year? And my guess is that he's not going to want that.
Kevin, you early on in this conversation mentioned the gaps and keep coming back to the gaps in achievement, which reflect gaps in opportunities. In the current environment, how do you think about keeping the focus on what you were suggesting, a combination of the gaps and those strategies and tactics that will actually have been demonstrated to close those gaps?
Yeah, well, we still operate in a world where results come out. We're going to get NAEP results in a few weeks, and that is going to give a lot of data on the trajectory of states in reading and math in 4th grade and 8th grade. And there's still annual assessment that comes out, and other people have said tests are not the be-all and end-all, and they aren't. But I think people need to, working together, make sure they are showcasing, especially for the lowest income kids, what the results actually are, district by district and state by state, and making sure that this is discussed and talked about and the centerpiece of the discussion. I think if it's not the centerpiece of the discussion, you can wind up having a lot of discussions about this policy or that policy, and you can lose the plot a little bit. And so I do think there's a role for everyone in the community to talk about outcomes and to point out whether we're making progress or not. And in the spirit of the optimism that you talked about, the campaign trying to operate with as part of its culture, I would point to a couple of reasons for long-term optimism. One is there are places in this country that have changed student results at scale over the last 10 to 20 years. So it can be done through smart, aggressive, assertive policy and implementation that is kid-centric. We know this. We have seen this before in different places. The other is we know a lot that we didn't know before. So you think about science of reading now, we could argue about whether we actually knew a bunch of this stuff on science of reading long ago and simply didn't do anything with it. But certainly people know it now. And there is real opportunity to take places like science of reading where there is true bipartisan consensus, lean in on it, demand better results for low-income kids and actually change trajectories over the next 10 years. But we will fumble it away if we spend our time arguing about other things.
You know, we were just talking about this at the campaign yesterday. We have a crisis in student outcomes, but we also are hamstrung by sometimes a crisis of confidence, of optimism, of belief that something positive can happen. And the easy answer is always the negative answer. You know, there's all this research that shows people think they are smarter, and people perceive them as smarter if they have skeptical or negative things to say. And so the easy narrative is, ugh, we've been spending all this money, we've been doing all these things, and look at, we have these crappy results. Here's the newest set of crappy results to prove that none of this works. We need a counter narrative for sure it creates some optimism and some hope that we can make real progress here. I'm curious, we have a question in the Q&A around the role of research and development, and what your hopes are for R&D that can help maybe focus resources in on the most effective kind of actions. Jean-Claude, I know you've given a lot of thought to this. Can I call on you to respond?
Absolutely. I mean, my organization, a third of our team are learning scientists who do a ton of research here in everything from mathematics to science to reading to technology. The one thing I would say is that we built a coalition of educators and leaders, frankly, who are pressing on the Senate and the current and future White House on the need quickly to not only, well, maintaining is not the solution. We've got to radically increase education R&D to really understand what works and what doesn't work. We don't spend anywhere the amount of money we need to in education research as we do for example, the military. There is an act that's been bipartisan sort of introduced to Congress called the NEED Act, NEED. We think that is a vehicle to bring the kind of substantial funding, frankly, for the work. That said, we do get funding from multilateral funders like the Gates Foundation and others. The National Science Foundation and IES is pushing on this. We just won a grant to do some work on the science of reading and artificial intelligence with 6 school districts who are the centerpiece of this work. So there's a few of us are pushing in earnest to really bring that kind of knowledge base to the sector, but we need a lot more money, and only the US government can support that kind of work. We're seeing efforts in other countries. The Oak Foundation in Europe has been supporting efforts to us. The Lego Foundation has been supporting some of the efforts here as well too. We need, frankly, our government to step up and pass a lead that this bipartisan. It's been introduced. It needs to get done so we can have the kind of support that we all need for getting this work done.
Mike, you see possibilities for some bipartisan agreement and some investment in that kind of research?
No. And I'm not just saying that to try to sound smart, John.
I know you want to sound smart. Of course you do.
I don't mean, I think there could be some bipartisan interest in some of those bills. I just think it's the spending. Spending is going to be tough. Look, we have an enormous deficit, and the appetite suddenly in Washington is to get serious about cutting spending. So they're going to be looking for things to cut. It's going to be really, really hard to add. So, this is all going to be about playing defense, I think, for the next 4 years.
Kevin, what do you think? You have more optimism than Mike? It wouldn't be hard to have more optimism than Mike's last comment.
Yeah, I mean, anything would be more optimistic than that, right? I don't know. The challenge is getting any piece of legislation passed. Forget about the spending. Just getting a piece of legislation passed in DC in this environment is going to be very difficult. And so that, in some ways, I feel like is a bigger hurdle than the spending itself, where I think when push comes to shove, certainly the last time this administration was in office, they didn't really seem to care about blowing up the budget. But getting something passed at all feels very hard. I do think that if you were going to get something done in education, R&D feels like a place where you could maybe muster up some support. if you could tie it into national competitiveness, if you could tie it into the future economic needs of the country, et cetera, I think people get that we've got a challenge.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Let's talk a little bit about, we verged onto it, but I want to go further on what you all think that folks who are positioned the way that people in the Campaign for Grade Level Reading Network are positioned. Community coalitions, their supporters, partners, and funders. Given the new context, given the ongoing challenges, where would you advise? Denise, I got you. You got data, storytelling, and work in coalition. What Ralph loves to talk about, and he's right, to talk about informed demand, the right kind of pressure on systems, the right kind of support for systems that are trying to do not easy things that involve some displacement, and then the right kind of accountability. I'm curious, and Kevin, you sat in one of these jobs. How do you see what folks like the folks in the campaign network can and should be doing? What should they, we've talked about what are you paying attention to? Then what do we do with this our commitment and this knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, I think pushing for data, pushing for transparent release of data, and pushing for discussion about outcomes. And then what I would say is, support for people who are doing the right things. It is actually, and Jean-Claude, I know you know this too, it's a lonely seat, and you hear from people who are unhappy. And, when a third of the people are unhappy and 2/3 of the people are happy, but the 2/3 of the people say nothing, it's very hard to stay the course, especially when you think about hard decisions like resource allocation and sharing unpopular truths and fighting for things that result in change that might result in people losing their jobs. And so I think some combination of supporting people who are actually pushing for things that are important for your community and making sure that people know you support them goes farther than people think it does. And then the ongoing pressure for the data and the release of data and the discussion around data. All of us have done the exercise of watching school board meetings either live or on video, and the extent to which they don't discuss student outcomes is really shocking to the conscience.
Really helpful. Jean-Claude, you too sat in a seat where there were a lot of constituents. I'm curious what you would say to folks who carry the focus and the determination that people in the campaign network carry. What would you advise them would be most helpful in the coming context?
Just on the line, something Kevin just said, I was told by my mentor when I was becoming a school superintendent, said, make sure you have a good lawyer and a good financial officer. You'll never be fired for lack of student outcome, but you'll be fired for financial scandal or legal scandal. It was a sad statement. But when you think about the work that needs to get done, and to Kevin's point, there's a lot of difficult decisions, and you need to be flanked, frankly, to be able to make those kinds of decisions. Otherwise, you don't last very long on the job. You can't get any of it done. When you're responding to a board of 7 elected officials, frankly, or even one elected official, you got to feed that person. Let me use perhaps what I've seen as tremendous success that's been done in Texas, and I'm going to call out the Commit Partnership in Dallas, who's been a lead architect in getting House Bill 3. I forgot the second bill that just came out with the higher education. Initially bought $7.5 billion in education in Texas. Yes, with the requisite accountabilities that were part of that kind of push and the support that needed to be done as well too. But when you talk to Todd Williams, it wasn't he who went to fight in Austin. He brought a coalition of folks from across the state to do the bidding and fighting that had to be done with the state legislature to get it done. The question is, how do we replicate that kind of flanking and support to make sure it happens? including, by the way, superintendents in that state who had to make difficult decisions. He found ways of supporting them holistically. Again, not 100% perfectly done, but it's a grass tops and a grassroots effort in making these kinds of things happen. When you see a strong leader making strong decisions, that individual needs to be supported and flanked by grassroots organizations and be protected. Otherwise, frankly, they won't last more than a year on the job. And then you go right back to square one again. That is important. The second thing I would say is that one thing I've learned too in that job is it has to be a relay race, which is that you're making tough decisions, but someone needs to come after to continue the work. Otherwise, you get this reset that happens every few years in the superintendency. But when you have folks who are passing the baton and the work continues, you're going to get the kind of outcomes you're looking for. I mean, Long Beach is my favorite example of that. Long Beach, California. For 25, 30 years, you've had successive leadership who've carried that baton, and that place continues to get better. It's something I heard from Tom Pezon when he was in Boston. We need a lot more of that, frankly, across the country. Otherwise, you're going to see this churn. And then talking to 150 plus superintendents, the biggest worry right now, frankly, the culture wars. The biggest worry is about the stress and trauma that they're experiencing, and they're quitting left and right. They're not staying on the job.
Yeah. Denise, I see you nodding. What are you thinking?
No, I everything that Jean-Claude said was absolutely, and Kevin, spot on. It is very hard to lead these days when you have a small group of voices telling you to get rid of books in your library or take down posters in your classroom, when there are absolutely bigger decisions that need to be made by a superintendent, whether it's on accountability, hiring great teachers, keeping the building safe, keeping their teachers and students safe, so many other questions than, what brand of history is going to be taught in the classroom. It is really hard these days, and our superintendents are feeling it. Our principals are feeling it. And, folks that want to go into the teaching profession are feeling it. So all across the education ecosystem, we really do need to see more support for that ecosystem. And I think that comes from many of the partners that are on the call right now. And, giving the applause where it needs to be given. But at the same time, sometimes you have to throw a little shade too. And it's knowing that right balance, right? That's going to push things even further along.
That's really helpful. There's been a lot of focus over the past few years around young people's well-being. Showed up in different ways, got different words associated with it. Some of those words have become somewhat red hot. And I wonder what you think will happen to the work that was really developed, by the Seed Commission, by the science of learning and development, sometimes translated into social emotional learning, but actually it's a category larger than that. And for the kids about whom we have the greatest concerns, often it's stuff that's outside the classroom and off the screen that is standing in the way of learning opportunities. What do you think happens with some of those impulses in the new context? Mike, you want to start out?
Look, I think we did a survey a few years ago about social and emotional learning, and the basic outcome was that across the spectrum, left, right, center, if you get specific and you talk about what are we actually talking about here, we're talking about things like communication skills and teamwork and character, and people support it, so you got to get below the label. Some of these labels end up getting caught up in the controversies. I think it's telling, for example, that we've had this huge push in the last year, lots of laws passed around banning cell phones in schools, Now that's a whole nother topic we could debate, right? But the point is, it's people are not coming at this by saying we have a bill about social and emotional learning. No, they say we have a bill about getting rid of cell phones in schools because we think that it's having all kinds of negative consequences, and that has gained support on left, right, and center. So it's just to say that you got to get specific. If we're talking about kids who are being bullied, talk about bullying. If you're talking about kids who need mental health support, say that. We can avoid some of those words that get caught up in the culture wars.
You agree with that, Denise? Did I ring the bell
I
for you?
do. I absolutely do. I think that, when you actually describe what these programs are doing, what they're trying to reinforce, people get it. It's very common sense, because it is about communication. It is about getting along with others. It is about feeling a sense of belonging,
Sure.
when they show up at school.
Sure.
So can I
But the
add to that?
caveat, John, is that this all works, but you got to not do crazy stuff. Okay, so that's the other thing, is that there was a time, we all kind of lost our heads in 2020 or so. There was some crazy stuff going on out there. So that's the other, obviously, if people are going to react to things that do feel over the line, that feel like indoctrination, that feel like somebody has a political agenda that they're trying to push on school children. I mean, so it can't be crazy, but if you focus on tried and true things, kindergartens have been teaching character forever. This is not controversial, and it doesn't need to be if it's common sense stuff.
Can I
Jean-Claude,
push a different angle to this? And I
please.
agree with Mike and of course Denise. One of the things that I push in this paper with the Hoover Institution, and I talk about often, is that what's changed since the Nation at Risk 40 years ago is that the School of Psychology is now talking to the School of Education in most universities, right? Before they were separated. We have come to really understand some of the science behind well-being, whatever you want to call it, and what it means for academic outcomes, right? That has been lost in that conversation where folks think they understand what this work is and begin to use words like gratitude, for example, which is not a scientifically based word, right? And forget about the fact that some of this is baked in what we know on learning science. When you talk about executive function, it is not a social emotional skill, it's an academic skill. And for many of these are precursors to academic outcomes. When you look at, I just put a link in the chat here that was, again, for disclaimer, my wife wrote the paper, was a cognitive scientist at Columbia University, and a quantitative researcher. When you begin to think about what this means to academic outcomes, you begin to understand what the work really is. Yes, away from the craziness, away from assuming we know what this is, and go back to the learning science, go back to what this means for academic outcome. I have visited the iLab at the University of Washington in Seattle, and what they do on neuroscience and neurobiology is groundbreaking. It hasn't yet made its way to pedagogical practices in schools, but it will. They can, through a brain scan, tell you when a child is ready to learn to read. Christ's sake, I was fascinated by that kind of conversation. They can show you a mom reading to a child live and watching all the brain activity, and then the same experiment is repeated through video, and there's no neural activity. And you wonder, what does that mean for online learning versus in-person learning? So many questions and understanding around the human connection. Education is human development. And we need to remember that. And when we understand the science behind what this is, then we'll understand why this whole child approach is so critical to closing the gaps that we're desperately trying to close. But right now, a lot of us make assumptions as to what we know about this. And so, John, last thing I'll say, I was at a conference you led in Washington, D.C., where grit was the topic of discussion. A lot of us latched onto this. Grit, if you remember, it was discussed as a combination of two skills, right? One is malleable, can be taught. One cannot be taught. You can't teach someone to be interested in something. You can expose them to it, but you can't teach perseverance. And that's the part we tend to forget about, the science behind this work. I get off my soapbox now.
That's great. One of the things that we talk about the most at the campaign right now is that over the course of the past several years, we identified learning loss, we actually identified a set of strategies, and you all helped us come up with those strategies. High dosage tutoring being one great example, that are effective for learning recovery, are effective for accelerating learning opportunities, especially for young people who are at the wrong side of those gaps. It feels like we don't need to name those things over and over again. We need to do those things. And a lot of the places where we fall down have to do with implementation. And Jean-Claude, you and I have talked about this often. Kevin, I'm curious what you're seeing. You've made a sale. People should do high dosage tutoring, but what are you seeing around implementation, which for us is one of the key focus areas for the next couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, it's spotty because it's hard. And one of the things that we've seen in state policy is that most states can't tell you actually how many kids are getting high dosage tutoring, how many sessions they got at the student level, et
The
cetera.
data question again.
So there's a real sort of data collection question. But in all of this work, I think too often we're all prone to get caught up in whether legislation passes and then lose interest on the actual sort of doing of the work. So you take science of reading. There's one state where I spent some time with the senior leadership of the state. They were passing science of reading legislation, and were very excited about it, and it was pretty good legislation. But at the end of the day, you need a 3-year plan for how are you going to figure out what's actually happening on the ground? How are you going to do a hearts and minds tour to actually make sure that people are educated and understand what's going on? How are you going to go around and ensure that people have access to the best materials and the best resources and the best training and professional development? Then how are you going to circle back around? It is a long-term implementation plan, and simply passing legislation doesn't get the job done. So we all have to have interest in that, and we all have to ask questions about what is actually happening, because that will expose the question of whether we're collecting the right data, whether we're paying attention to the right things, et cetera.
That's really helpful. I think there's one of the things we're really going to focus on is how can people in our network be most demanding and supportive and do accountability work around implementation. There's the passing a bill, there's the selection of the right strategies, and then there's the implementation. Jean-Claude, you were so jacked up about implementation a few years ago. You bent my ear about this. So tell me how you're thinking about implementation right now.
I just put a link to a book, one of the first books I read on the idea of execution. I learned a long time ago, a lot of times it's about execution. I had a great discussion yesterday with Shel Shrensky, who's the president of Bank Street College, former colleague of mine in New York City. We talked about the layers of implementation in a school system. And very often what you find is that the school line is not there. There's no thinking through of the kind of deliberate actions that need to take place at multiple levels of the system to get something implemented. By the way, even in science of reading, there's a heart and mind piece there too. I think Kevin mentioned that, which is really, really important. I know districts who are refusing to implement this, although they know the science, but the adults are so caught up in whole language teaching. They love it and they can't let go of it because they've not been convinced this actually works. So one, there's a science of implementation, which is really critical, that we know folks of Carnegie has been a leader in, but the whole idea of understanding how a system works, and that when you think about the rabbit and the elephant with our social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, right? You have to get the elephant to believe and the rider to believe. Very often we focus on the rider, not the elephant. You've got to get people believing, and you've got to have a deliberate set of actions in implementing. Otherwise, frankly, you're never going to get the work executed. And what's the old adage, right? A culture eats strategy for lunch. So you got to make sure you focus on that as well, too.
I think this is a really interesting and important question. I think we'll come back to you guys on this. Time and time again, because I think it's hard work for coalitions to do. because there's a lot of details, and people who quote unquote know more than you can sort of dazzle you and tell you it's complicated this way and it's complicated that way. And then you're sort of forced into an accountability rather than a support kind of role, which feels like a scold, and it's not a good dynamic. But we have to figure out the ways to support high quality, to understand what high quality implementation really looks like, and to support that that implementation over time. Denise, I want to do one last round of questions, and let's go ahead and put up the poll. We'll keep talking, but we'll put up the poll too if we can. Thank you. Denise, we're about early school success, and I wonder, I want to just, from our last question for everybody, I want to zero in on early school stuff and whether you think there are particular things that are about to happen or could happen that would zero in on K through 3 or even pre-K through 3 that would help with early learning and early school success. And let's put in early numeracy as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm expecting that the states will have more success than any activity that happens at the federal level, and mostly because of the number of states who are investing in the science of reading. But again, this is another place where implementation is very uneven, and we need a greater focus on what good looks like. We know what good looks like, but it seems to be very hard for some folks to actually put that into motion. The other place that, we're seeing, I think, gradual interest is around early literacy and numeracy. And I think that's really exciting. But again, I'm more interested in what's going to happen at the state and local level, because I'm not quite sure whether we even want the federal government to engage in this at this time. They've tried it before and they weren't very successful, and besides Head Start, which has been very successful. But I'm looking at the states and locals to see something exciting happening.
Mike, how do you think about opportunities and or risks for early learning?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'd point to the child tax credit as a big
Yep.
fight in Washington that I think is super important for little kids. And then here's an idea, maybe it's crazy, but a strange bedfellow's idea, which is that in these states that are passing these education savings accounts programs, you could imagine pushing to have the eligibility start before kindergarten, that you could make it eligible for kids at age it's at least 3 and 4. And then parents would have these savings accounts that they could use for preschool and childcare. So, maybe there could be some blending there in places where there's a lot of enthusiasm for school choice and there hasn't been yet success in getting across the line on universal pre-K or something close to it.
Gotcha. Kevin, what do you think about early learning opportunities?
One thing in early literacy with AI, I think there are tools that are being built, and we're starting to see some of them used in the tutoring space, which is a good laboratory for some of this stuff, that have really strong potential in the earliest grades because they're taking on the finite universe of phonemes and so on. And I think that there could be low cost, high quality tools that could work in conjunction with teachers to make the lift a little bit easier in the earlier grades. So that's something over the next couple of years. I'm often skeptical of AI tools, but I think we're starting to see some things in certain areas that have really high potential, and early literacy is one place.
When you think about AI and early literacy, are you thinking about AI that works directly with students or that helps those who are working with young people?
I'm talking about working directly with students.
Interesting.
And obviously, nothing is going to take the place of a teacher. But I think if you can think about things that can supplement a teacher who can't be 22 places at once, and help give kids the kind of repetition and practice that is responsive to what they are doing, I think there's potential.
Fantastic. Jean-Claude, now you get the first last word, and now you get the last word.
Let me start with an optimistic note. My pessimistic note is the fact that early learning is a system non-system, which is, I think, a challenge for us in the US. So much of what happens before pre-K, before age 4, is outside of the P12 system, which creates this kind of dissonance and disconnect, frankly, with what needs to happen in K1 and 2 and 3, however you define early learning. So that needs to be fixed on funding, frankly, teacher capacity. We don't pay these people anything whatsoever. We're working below age 4. It's a travesty that needs to be fixed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On a positive note, I just put something in the link in the chat that aligns with what Kevin is pushing. This effort we call UGAIN, with MDRC, Penn, GSC, and 6 school districts is going to focus on multilingual learners and early learning, science reading, artificial intelligence, which we believe is going to provide frankly some real knowledge for the sector. So good things are coming.
I love that. I love that. The last word is an optimistic word. I just want to say, as our first session of the year, you all were fantastic. We were delighted to hear from you. We're concerned and energized in the right measures, I hope. And you know that we're all coming back to you for more conversations to come. But for today, just a huge thanks on behalf of everybody who watched and listened, and everybody at the campaign.